Welcome to the Heroes of Reality podcast, a podcast about the game of life and the hero's journey we all experience. Let's jump in with our host, Dylan Watkins, as he introduces today's guest.
Welcome, adventurers. Dylan here. And on today's podcast, I have Dr. Graham Norris. He is an organizational psychologist focusing on the foresight and future thinking. He spent 20 years living in Asia, including decades as a journalist in Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan. Most recently, he worked in marketing consultant and communications in Beijing, China, before moving back to the UK. He holds an MBA from Hoi Wat University, pretty sure I mispronounced that, and studied the impact of rapid change on Chinese knowledge workers for his doctoral research. His passion is helping people cultivate a healthier attitude towards the future. He is now the COO of Super Trends Institute, a global learning platform that encourages future thinking so its members can make better decisions and generate more ambitious strategies. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Dr. Graham Norris.
Hi there, Dylan.
Hey, doctor, how goes it?
Pretty good. And yourself?
I'm doing great, brother. I'm doing great.
Excellent.
Yeah, you're in the UK right now, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I'm about 30 minutes west of Heathrow Airport in a place called Maidenhead.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you for making it on the podcast. I'm glad to connect, and I'm really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, organizational psychologist. Can you please explain to me just a little bit more how you got into the space of being an organizational psychologist? What is the passions and interests, and what was your origins of that?
Well, that's a good question. So I was living in China, actually. I moved there in 2010. And I was really fascinated by the pace of change there. And it was actually kind of infectious in some ways, just this sense of urgency to sort of grasp the moment because the economy is opening up and a lot of economic activity there. And so I started doing an MBA, even though I never had it in my mind to do an MBA, but I just sort of felt this urge to learn and try to be engaged with this sense of urgency. And during that, I started getting interested in the psychological aspects of that, really learning about myself and how other people worked. And so I developed that into a doctorate subsequently, looking at change and adaptability in Chinese knowledge workers. So how this really rapid change, how that really affects people and how they can understand what's happening around them and break through all that noise. And so that's how I then moved into organizational psychology out of marketing and public relations, which was what I was in before, and then moving further into looking at the future and how people can use foresight and the tools of foresight to better adapt to their present.
That's awesome. So with that, what do you think are the cultural causes to really have the Chinese knowledge workers have such a rapid embracing of future technologies? Like what caused them, and culturally speaking, to really have that those traits?
Well, I say it's not really necessarily that they have any particular traits. I would just say, they are a product of their time. So really you can look at what's happening in China is you'd have several generations of experience in the West compressed into a single lifetime in China. So some people who maybe brought up in very, very humble beginnings, maybe sort of 30 or 40 years ago, now have mobile phones and internet and nice apartments and cars and all these other things. So I think that's just a product of technology as they're experiencing it now in an economy that's being opening up very quickly. It simply wasn't this kind of rapid change wasn't happening in, say, the UK or the United States at that time. The pace of technological change was much slower. And so I'd say it's really just they are a result of particular time in which they're living. But we can also see it in the West. Some people now entering the workforce, for example, they're likely to go through many jobs, maybe even switch careers several times before they retire. And of course, a lot of people talking about maybe never retiring and never dying. But that's quite different from previous generations. My father did the same job his entire life. So it's really a sign of the times, if anything.
Mm-hmm. And then have you noticed cultural differences, say, between China and Japan, and we'll say the US, in terms of their ability to adapt to this type of change?
That's a good question. And actually, originally, I wanted to do that kind of comparative study, but between various countries. I would say it's very difficult to know. I'm generally a person that would say that culture is really a veneer, and the people are generally very, very similar. Obviously, we have separate traits, and we're all individuals in our own way. And culture is really, I mean, it's been described as the sort of what was it, the software of the mind or something. It's really just how we interpret our experiences. It's not really changing the hardware. I would say, Japan also went through periods of quite rapid change in the 70s and 80s, where they probably had similar kinds of experiences, but probably not as in that accelerated way that they have in China at the moment. Japan, having lived there, I mean, it's certainly quite a bit different culture from other developed economies that I've lived in. But be difficult for me to say how that's impacted their approach to change, simply because it's already a very advanced developed economy. So it's sometimes the case. It's difficult once you reach the edge to keep on pushing further and faster.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, looking at Japan, those are places. I was there for a little while, and you can see that it's a really interesting blending of super old technology, super ancient like culture with cutting edge technology, and they merge it well together. And there's this kind of interesting ability to be very groupthink, right? Versus like in the US, we're very individualistic, right? So it's interesting how those psychological effects and how you're right, everyone's an individual, but how the culture affects the actual way that you interact with people, social pressures and such.
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating in Japan how they have taken their, the original Japanese culture, the threads of that, and how they sort of manifest themselves in modern Japan. Whereas in other societies, you drop or discard a lot of old culture to embrace something new about the present and the future. Whereas, Japan it's interesting how that's translated into this kind of postmodern culture.
Yeah. So it's interesting. The things that you study right now is really helping people adapt to this future-focused mindset, which is, this ability to be comfortable with the uncomfortable changing times. Like, in terms of that, it's because it is the times in our ability to adapt. I mean, what do you really think, and looking into this, are some of the mindsets or skill sets that really enable someone to adapt to changing times?
Sure, I think that's a big question. You think about how to organize that.
Feel free to unpack it however you like, or break off a piece of it. We'll go back and forth. I know it's the main thing that you do, so it's kind of like tell me your whole life story in a sentence, but
Sure. So humans, I mean, we really are the only animal that could really productively think about the future or engage in mental time travel. So we can consider the past and think about the future. Other animals aren't really geared up to do that to any great extent. They're really stuck in the present. So we have this capacity to consider the future, but it's far from perfect. And it was developed, evolved over a long period of time, but also mostly during periods where we only had to think about the, relatively short term. So, for example, if you think 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years ago, there wasn't really much point thinking more than a year down the road. You might have to think about it, the following seasons, but it wasn't really useful to think 5 years down the road. So in that kind of situation, if you have a problem, if you have a decision to make, you can very quickly get an answer because you can exhaust these sources of information quite quickly. You may have a look around, you may ask someone, maybe ask the village elder, and that's it. You're done. You've got to pull the trigger and accept the consequences. Now, in modern society, if you think we have to make a lot more decisions, a lot about things that have impact even further down the road, have a lot more longer term influence that you need to consider, and you have almost infinite amount of information on which to base those decisions. And that is quite overwhelming because you even have to make a decision about when you've got enough information to make the decision. And you could just endlessly spin the wheels on these things. And you can feel the pressure to say, well, it's a strain. It's a mental strain to think further down the road. It's much easier to think about later on today or tomorrow than it is 10 years. It's much more difficult to imagine that 10 years down the road. And in fact, our brains even regard ourselves 10 years, in the future as a different person to the one that they're thinking about today. And so with all of these psychological stresses, it's a struggle. And I would say one of the main things people can do to sort of get their arms around that is to accept the uncertainty by strengthening our ability to pay attention, to concentrate. I would say attention is really our only resource, even more important than time. And because you can spend time any way you want, but what you're focusing on, what you're paying attention to is your experience of that. And so I know a lot of people may think sort of meditation, all these kinds of things are a little bit, woohoo or whatever. But it really is, I talk about hard mindfulness because it's not a soft skill. It is the skill that you can bring to bear to what you're doing, making decisions, thinking about the future. So that means having the discipline, the mental discipline and strength to be able to look into the future a long way and to make good decisions about that in the present. So I'd say that's probably the number one. There's lots of other ones as well, but that would be the number one where you'd start off.
It's so funny. You're absolutely right on that. There's this weird cognitive dissonance you get when you're like, oh, screw future me. I'm not worried about that guy. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to pleasure myself right now. And I'm going to do whatever I want right now because this is me. And it has negative consequences and effects in the future, but you have that disconnection between those 2 points. So how does hard mindfulness and this mental discipline cause those things to be reconnected? Like how does that actually work? And what is it when you're saying that, what is the habit or behavior that they actually do on a daily basis to cultivate that?
Well, so you're really talking here about sort of developing good habits, and so there's a lot of sort of research it goes into how to create good habits and try to give up bad ones. I guess one of the things is to make decisions that about your future when you're in a good state. So, for example, you don't make decisions about what you want to eat when you're hungry. So you're never going to make a good decision about that. And so it's things like that. I was reading a book recently about, what our minds are really geared up for is not necessarily, it's not really thinking, it's really predicting. And it's all about the budget, the mental budget about your physical processes. And so it's about, appreciating what you're going to be, how your body sort of responds to the environment and how it's trying to make predictions about, what kind of resources it's going to need in terms of energy and how much effort it's going to be putting into things and what kind of return it's going to get. So, for example, the example they gave is if you're thirsty, you drink a glass of water, and then immediately you don't feel thirsty anymore. But actually, the water doesn't enter your bloodstream or anything until about 20 minutes later. But your brain knows all fine now. So it's about appreciating some of those aspects of how the body works. There's another interesting sort of line of research. I forgot the name of the technique now, but basically you can envisage the future. Say you want to write a book. So then you picture yourself having written the book and you're holding the book and it's published and everything's great. So you have this picture, and some people think that is motivating in itself. But there's also some thinking that says, actually, the more you imagine yourself having written that book, the more your brain thinks that you've already done it. And when you come to some obstacles to do with writing that book, your brain's like, what the hell? I didn't sign up for that. I signed up for having written this book.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes even more difficult to overcome those obstacles. So it's actually more effective to, imagine yourself having written the book and holding the book, but also imagine, what is it like to sit down and write 1,000 words day after day after day? What is it like to have to write your proposal and get it rejected and everything else? And once you consider those as well, then you have a much better chance of picking up that habit of writing the 1,000 words every day to get you to the objective of writing the book. So that's one thing to consider.
That's awesome. It's really interesting that you talk about that because you're right. Is you have this, humans have this natural tendency. So for example, I want to lose weight. So I'm going to buy this program online. You're like, great, bought the program. I'm not going to go through it, but I bought the program, so I feel good. And then that feeling goes away because you already have scratched that itch psychologically. That task is done by taking that action. But it's really the process, the habits and things like that. So instead of future thinking about, oh, this is what's going to feel like to have this reward, you're more like, okay, look for the situations that suck and really focus on those moments and embrace the moments of how they suck and really say, okay, this is what I'm going to be in, this is what I'm going to be doing, and settle in with that emotion so that when that comes, you're not blindsided by whether the monotony or whatever your monkey mind wants to do to get away from that emotion, which is really cool thought process. I've never heard of someone talking about looking at the most painful spots and really thinking about them and just going, yes, that is what I'm going to be doing, because that's going to get me. It's creating like a new narrative and relationship with those difficult conversations and what you're going to be coming up with. So that's really an interesting thing. Do you know the name of the book you were reading?
Well, that one comes from a book called Prospective Psychology, and it's by the author of that particular bit is Gabrielle Ertinger, I think is how you pronounce her name. Sometimes you never hear these names pronounced, but yeah, it's an academic book though. It's not a light read. But have you what kind of good habits have you picked up, and how did you manage to do that?
So I mean, there's a lot of ones I pick up throughout the times. One of the ones I pick up, I have a solid morning routine, right? So I go through that whole process of like making sure my mind's clear, journaling, what you would expect, green drinks, exercise, all that stuff. And then I nighttime stack in the evening times with a habit journal. So I track all my habits in the evenings to make sure that I do everything that I need to do, and I go through the process. And so I kind of make a list of all my big goals, and I break those goals down into what are the daily habits I need to do. And then I check those off at the end of the night. And so I keep a process of that to make sure that I'm actually stepping through what I need to do. And if I see a through line of me not doing the things I need to do on my habits, I go, okay, what action do I need to take to propel me in the direction that I need to go through? So if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great to have that kind of discipline. Again, actually, it's not a very nice sounding word, right? But discipline can get you a long way.
It's unsexy necessities or necessity neededs. Let me ask you a question about this. So, organizational psychology versus psychology. What is the difference between those two? I mean, it's a group of people, right, versus an individual. How do you treat them different, and how are they the same?
Well, actually, so some aspects of organizational psychology are groups, but it could also be regarding individuals. And I would say psychology traditionally was particularly clinical psychology was looking for problems, and so it was all about helping people with mental challenges, and then of course along came positive psychology. So it wasn't just about trying to help people out of despair. It was about how can we take sort of I don't want to call them normal people, but anyway, people of average disposition and take them to somewhere even better. And so that was sort of for the masses, if you will. For an organization, it's simply a context. I mean, a lot of the principles are largely the same, but it tends to boil down a little bit more down to not happiness but performance. So a lot of it's about assessments. So people entering organizations, are they going to fit, basically? So fit's a common kind of word there. People going for promotions, are they going to be able to perform at a different level? Yeah. So and that can lead into coaching and all kinds of other things. So it's true there is more of a social aspect to that, because the performance usually will include their relationships with other people. But it's based on the same sort of basics of what's going on in an individual brain.
How do you create psychological safety so that people at work don't lie to you?
It sounds like you're reading that one out then.
Well, like, I'm doing this. Oh, fill out this assessment. Tell me what you really think about your boss. Everything's great. I love this. The world's awesome. No, can I move on? Because they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear. But the hardest thing is getting through to psychological safety to actually create the truth, to have that come out. So how do you create that in an organizational setting?
Sure, I it's not a sort of area of expertise for me. So, and I'm sure people have written about that in some details. I would say it's not probably as complicated as people make out. I would say that, if you have a relationship with someone, if you have a friend, for example, I don't want to pretend that friends and co-workers are exactly the same, but if you have a relationship with a friend, the better that relationship is, the more you nurture it, the less surprises you're going to get from that friend, right? That person's not suddenly going to go and, smash up your house or something. And I would say with your co-workers, and you wouldn't find that a chore. You wouldn't say, how do you create psychological safety with your friend, right? Now with your co-workers, because you don't necessarily choose your co-workers, you're gonna have a wider range of kinds of relationships you have to manage there, and particularly if you're a supervisor of some description. But if you're paying attention to what people are saying and doing, and if you care about what they're, care about these people, even the ones you don't necessarily particularly like personally, then you shouldn't be struggling to create an environment where people are comfortable to share with you. And of course, some of them never will be. Some people are really about, okay, works, and the rest of my life is the rest of my life, and I'm not going to share, even though maybe my personal life is influencing my work, but that's my problem. Whereas other people, more and more, you see the case, okay, these things are all a little bit sort of blended up. So I would say it's really a matter of common sense as much as anything.
Yeah, well, sometimes
probably massively oversimplifying it, and so someone's written a book about this.
I've books written on all topics. I was just curious from your perspective, just because a lot of times people want. Sometimes they sit in the uncomfortability of the situation. You're trying to improve an organization. You're trying to help them get to one place, but they don't want to actually deal with it. So they'll tell you what they think you want to hear, right? And so in order to actually get to the truth of the matter of what's going on, it's a very difficult thing in an organization, even for yourself. I mean, you're psychologically wise, you have survival patterns and situations where you're actually, you want to get across to some chasm, but there's some sort of like underlining narratives preventing that progress. So I was just curious if you had any systems or frameworks or things for actually creating that type of, because that's really what it is. You need a safe place to really let loose and be like open and honest and vulnerable to get to where you need to go. And so that's why.
Sure. I mean, there was actually a thing I learned quite a long time ago, actually, before I got into any of this, called situational leadership. And that's really about, and I found that really powerful in terms of basically you have people, if you're a supervisor, then it's basically a structured way of finding out for any particular task how the person feels about it. And so you look at their competence, and you look at, have they done similar things before? Do they know what they're doing? And then how motivated are they to do it? How interested, how confident are they feeling about that? And it's basically a tool to have a structured conversation about these things specifically. I found that amazing. I had someone who was working for me, and she was supposed to be writing this press release, and she was from California, a very bubbly person. And so every time I asked her, she was like, yeah, I'm on it. Yeah, it's great, But then day after day, it wasn't happening. And I was like, okay, this is a bit of a red flag. So I sat down and we had this very structured conversation about this thing. And then, it all comes out. It's actually, she has no idea what she's doing. And she doesn't really feel confident about it at all. So in the context of the office, even though she's, normally quite an open, sort of positive person, but actually she was a little bit kind of, for whatever reason, kind of kicking it down the road or covering it up or whatever. So to actually just sit down and just to have that conversation around that was very, very powerful. And I've used that many, many times since. Situational leadership. It's a fantastic tool.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And it actually brings a really good point, because, people want to show up, they want to do the best, they want to contribute, but then they have these underlying belief patterns or whatever around, I don't know what I'm doing, just smile and keep moving forward. And sometimes as parents or other things, you do the same type of thing. I know where I'm going, but you don't. And it's very difficult to kind of communicate that. With that, I mean, what are some of these, what I would call threshold guardians, preventing people from adapting and really getting to where they want to go, whether it's the communication or embracing these skill sets or mindsets? What do you think are some of the typical roadblocks that people face as they're trying to become who they want to become, whether for an organization or for themselves?
You're fascinated me there. Threshold guardians. I've not heard that before. Where did you get that from? What's that about?
So this podcast is all based on the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey is a narrative story arc created by Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a dude. Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell?
No, I'm familiar with the hero's journey, not intimately,
It,
but a bit of it.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's the dude who not invent yeah, he compiled it. He went around and studied
Mm,
all the myths, religions, and cultures all around the world, and he realized that there was the same narrative arc of people going around and saying, "Oh, okay." And there was all the same types of stories. Young person, leaves their community and goes, sets on an adventure, goes and he battles threshold guardians to really go.
mm,
He finds a mentor, someone who gives him a superpower, an ability, a weapon, a tool to do battle. Fights and fights and fights. It goes where he almost dies, loses his, maybe feels like he's going to die. He has a death of an ego, fights a dragon or something, gets the Holy Grail, comes back, brings it back to the community, sometimes accepted, sometimes rejected, and then, goes off to be a mentor for other people. It's a story as old as time. It's something that we love. It's something that is innate in our human psyche and consciousness. And so, along the path of human transformation, you're going to battle threshold guardians, whether external or internal, right? And so along the path with these people that want to actually be better for the organization or for themselves, they're going to battle threshold guardians. And that's just the terminology he created.
mm.
Disney, Lucas, everybody else said, that sounds great. Let's make a billion movies about the same thing and then just change the title over and over and over again. So Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, all of it's based upon the same narrative. It's different, zigs and zags along the path. Sometimes it's a group, sometimes it's individual. But essentially that's where the terminology comes from.
Got it. Got it. Thank you for that. Yeah, threshold guardian. I quite like it. Another big question: what kind of threshold guardians do people face? You're talking about in the workplace, or?
Yeah, in the workplace, so they want to get to
Mm.
where they want to go. They want to transform organizational psychology. What are the typical threshold guardians or challenges that they face, internal or external, that prevent them to get to where they want to go?
So I would say that's another interesting question. I would say I'm trying to think. Some of the work I do with a bank, I talk to a lot of people there, and it's really managing the transitions just for this group I'm thinking about,
Sure.
particularly the transition from an individual contributor who's just doing their thing up to a people manager. That transition is quite a massive one for people, and I would say a lot. It's still kind of neglected about how that transition happens. So maybe people get some training, maybe they don't. And it's true, a lot of it is a bit about the field, but still, there are a lot of tools and ways of thinking about things, such as situational leadership, to help them make that transition.
Mm,
And knowing the important things, because it's unless someone tells you a little bit about it, then you think, okay, I've got some power and I've got some authority, but what am I supposed to do with it?
yeah.
What do people expect from me? And unless you've had a fantastic leader to learn from, then you're really gonna struggle to lead other people. So that's one of the things I see. And then at another level up
Yeah.
is kind of the networking aspect. Is having good, reliable networks you can rely on to get you wherever you want to go next. Because it really becomes a lot more about the relationships. And you've got to do that in an authentic way. I mean, some people talk about sort of visibility and doing this kind of thing, 80-20 rules. You spend 80% of your time doing stuff and 20% of your time, telling people about it and promoting yourself. All this kind of thing. And, people have got all different types of tactics, but being genuinely useful to people
Mm-hmm.
and having conversations and finding out what's going on and investing the time to get out of your stuff and really talking to people to find out what's going on. And I think that's probably the big challenge.
Those are good ones. I mean, if you look at that, I mean, all of it involves people and other people and communicating with other people. And you're talking about the going from an individual who's probably, it sounds like they're good at their job. It's like the difference going from a salesperson to being a sales manager. You might be good at selling, but you might be bad at telling other people how to sell and or manage them in a way that is effective. Effective being both causing sales to happen and having people feel good about you driving those sales systems forward. So because you can cause burnout or other things. So it seems like a lot of that's switching from a technician of a thing to actually being a leader, which are not necessarily the same thing.
Absolutely. And you see some industries where this is a big challenge. And for example, journalism. So I used to be in journalism, and reporters and to some extent editors, in general, there's nothing about being a reporter that indicates that you're going to be a good people manager. You're going to be a good leader. Nothing.
Yeah.
There's no qualification there at all.
Yeah.
And yet the organization I used to work for, almost by definition, the CEO of the company would have been a former journalist, a former reporter. And it doesn't. And I've met reporters who were kind of thrust into leadership roles and hated it. And they were lousy managers because they just weren't interested in it. The oil industry is another one. My wife used to be in the oil industry, and it's the same. Those are engineers. Engineers are very numbers oriented people. They're not people, right? They have very high, in their cubicles, they have very high walls around their cubicles. They're not there to kind of, it's not a newsroom where you're throwing stuff around. They got very high walls, and so they don't make necessarily that great managers. So there's a lot of industries like that.
It's funny. They love what they do. They just don't love people, and that's the
Yeah.
I've never heard of very high walls around their cubicles, but I know that because in a lot of the development spaces that I'm a part of, they're like, just let me do my job. I just want to do my job. I like being alone. I'm just happy. I have a relationship with the computer. Let me just build that up. What do you think in terms of inspiring these people, whether they want it or not? How do you give them these skill sets in terms of transition into a leader, transition the networking skills? Maybe let's assume that they want to do it, but they just don't know how. What are some, either the mindset or the skill sets required in order to get them to be good at leading people or be good at networking? What does that look like?
For the people management skills, obviously experience is one thing, but to be able to have one useful thing is actually interviewing people, and actually being responsible for hiring, which is often not what they're given responsibility for. Normally that's given somewhere else. But once you've had that responsibility, then you kind of focus a lot more on, these different kinds of people and assessing them in different ways, and then you see yourself in a different way. But there's a lot of tools and methodologies about management. I don't know of any sort of silver bullet there, or golden bullet to get that done. And in terms of networking, you got to, I'd say, investing the time, but also knowing your limits. So I'm quite an introverted person, so for me, networking is a bit of a slog. And so you appreciate that, and you appreciate the fact that you're better at doing it in some situations than others. I learned public speaking so that I could stand in front of a group of people, which helps a lot when you're communicating with people. Yeah. But you also appreciate you're going to have to recharge your batteries. You can't be doing, some kinds of networking or doing it all the time. You're just going to wear yourself out and not do it very well. So I think, knowing yourself, knowing your limits, knowing the ways that networking is going to work well for you, and investing the time in it.
That's awesome. In terms of, you're looking at, you talked about recharging your batteries, making sure you're in a good state before you go and, speak with people publicly or, intimately. How do you recharge your batteries? Like, what does that look like for you in terms of making sure that you're in a positive state, making sure that you have a full battery? How do you do that?
Sure. Being physically well rested is very useful. I think, some people can very naturally engage with others. It's just second nature to them. In fact, they find it a bit painful if they're not doing that. Right? My daughter's quite interesting in the fact that she's completely different from me. She just talks to anybody about anything all the time, and she's only 4, right? So, and she has absolutely no inhibitions about that whatsoever. Yeah, that was great. But whereas for me, if I've realized over the years actually, and there's nothing wrong with it, but actually sort of thinking through it, even writing it down. Okay, what do I want to get out of this next engagement with this person? What do I want to talk about? I used to feel that was, be too artificial, and you could over-script it, of course. But I don't think there's anything wrong in thinking through what you want from engagements with people, because that quite likely will make it better for both people, particularly if you're not naturally going to be, just sort of, if you're not naturally sort of a very engaged person that likes engaging with people.
Yeah. Well, if you're natural at it, then it's a honed skill that you just already do, and you like to, you don't need to cultivate it. But if you're trying to cultivate it, and I love the idea of writing it down, thinking it out, going through the process, and kind of like, so you don't go off the tracks into the ditch, and that's a really powerful process.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at those people with a lot of charisma, people talk about Bill Clinton or Nelson Mandela as people having a lot of charisma. They could just show up and do their stuff. You have to appreciate. Maybe you're a Nelson Mandela kind of person, maybe you're not, and so you're just gonna accommodate that. Your skills are in other areas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Also that awareness of knowing where you are and where you're at. It probably helps to get an understanding and kind of see where you want to go. You talked about like assessments and stuff. I mean, are there certain like personality tests or things that you subscribe to that you like? I mean, do you like 16 personalities, or is there some other assessment that you really gravitate towards to understand yourself or understand others?
I'll be honest with you. I'd say you'd be better off taking several different ones. Every test. I mean, a lot of them are based on the big 5 personality traits, but they often come at it from slightly different ways. The more sort of modern ones will look at your various different personality traits in different situations, and I think that's quite important. Is because it's not a fixed thing that you are the same person, home or in private as you are in public, or as you are when you're stressed out. You'll demonstrate different personality traits there. So I think those ones which give a little bit more rounded view of the person, rather than just saying, okay, this person is like this all the time, are more sophisticated. So I'm trained in one called Luminous Spark, for example, which does that. But there are.
I never heard of Luminous Spark. So it's like a battery of different tests?
Lumina does lots of different ones. So Spark is the sort of generic personality one. But yeah. So that's not bad. And but I would say that there are different. I've done lots of different tests in my time, and they all taught me something. And so if you have a chance, take it. You always find out something.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like kind of like a no BS palm reading, right? You kind of get the insights yourself and say, oh, okay, well, this is how I do, and these are the things I look at. That's great.
That's right. I mean, because personality, this word is very difficult to define. And so, and particularly when the more you try to grasp it, the more you find it's actually, you can't grab hold of this idea.
Like happiness.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got this very nebulous concept, and then you try to use these words to describe it, like extrovert or introvert or what have you. And these words also have their own meanings. It might mean something a little bit different to me than it does to you. And of course, when you do it in a different language, they'll have different meanings again. And of course, in other languages, they have different personality trait words for things that we haven't even thought about.
Do you speak different languages?
I speak Chinese. Mandarin Chinese, yeah.
Do you feel
not
like
flawlessly by any stretch, but
do you feel I've heard people say that when they actually get fluent with another language, they get really fluent with it. They actually adopt a different personality when they speak a different language. Have you noticed that to be true, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It could be that I was dating a girl in Japan many years ago, and she actually sort of mentioned the fact that she got a bit tired speaking Japanese to people because it was such a kind of restrictive kind of language, and you kind of had to show up with a certain kind of personality, if you like, that respectful of this person and very mindful of the dynamic and social dynamics. Whereas you speak in English, there was a foreigner in her job, and she's just like, it was just so easy to talk to this person because in English you don't have to worry about all this stuff. So you could well be right. I have to admit, it's hard to. I haven't noticed it so much in other people when speaking Mandarin, but and I haven't noticed it myself. But it could be the case.
Yeah, there's definitely a respect, social responsibility in Japan. I like being the white guy in Japan with a fanny pack and a tank top asking for ketchup on my sushi. It's very fun to see. It's very fun to see their responses, to see how offended they get with that, because you're like, who cares? But there's so much, like, they're a beautiful culture, love the whole people, but it's interesting to see that the social dynamics. And you're right, there's a pressure to that performance. So that's super interesting. Um, with you, and like with what you're doing with your company, I mean, do you have like a holy grail, like, of what you want to do with these organizational psychology or the company in itself, or do you have something, an end goal that you're shooting for with this?
So, for me personally, I'm all about cultivating a healthier attitude toward the future, and that really means that boils down to making decisions, better decisions. I would say that a lot of people, all decisions are about the future, right? Our lives are just flows of decisions. Either with some of them we're not, but most of them we're not thinking about, but the ones we're thinking about are the ones we can influence. And so this is another aspect of having that strength of attention, is to know what we're making decisions about and what we should be making decisions about. And I think being able to, if you look at people who have to think about the future to some extent, they often just don't, or they shy away, or and we see a lot, in the UK, for example, after, the vote to leave the European Union in 2016, a couple of years later, we still hadn't left, and everybody was like, well, what's going to happen? And I used to ask some small business owners that I was hanging around with, it's like, what do you think is going to happen? What's it going to mean for you? And they'd roll their eyes and go, oh, I don't know, it's too complicated, I don't want to think about it, right? But actually, yes, okay, it was a bit complex, but there's only so many possible outcomes. Either we leave or we don't leave, or it drags on. And you can look at those and break them down, and you can say, well, it's going to be some variation of these. What does this mean for me? What are the threats if this happens, or if that happens, or the other thing happens? What are the opportunities? And you can look into the dark hole. Even none of those options are particularly, none of these things were particularly pleasant to think about for these people. And yet when you look into the dark hole, then you realize actually maybe it's not as dark as you realize, maybe not as terrible. And actually you'll find some light in there and some possibilities, some opportunities. Yeah. And it's a little bit the same, I've seen with the pandemic. And I don't want to sort of play down, the problems it's caused people and the terrible things that have happened. But, a lot of people have been sitting around going, I don't know what's going to happen. Well, no, it's not easy to know exactly what's going to happen or when. But when you really look at it, you can understand some threads of or some trends, if you like, or threads of activity that will indicate to you what's going to happen, and have a better idea about when. You just got to apply yourself a little bit, do a little bit of research, and see what it means for you. It takes effort, but there are ways of thinking about things, and even just sitting down and just reading some stuff and try to synthesize that to understand what's going to happen. And so, yeah, there's just really a lot of things people can do, just a little bit of effort to consider the future, and you can make much better decisions for yourself.
That's awesome. And so, yeah, it seems like when people feel like it's too big, too complicated, too scary, too, overwhelming, whatever that thing might be, they don't want to look at it. They don't want to focus on it. They want to avoid it. And you're saying, if you focus on it and you avoid it, and you pay attention to it, and you sit with it, then you'll naturally start to kind of make progress towards an understanding or an acceptance of the thing. When you're talking about this, and you're talking about one of the best ways to prepare yourself to be future fit is to be able to focus and strengthen your attention. And you talked about a couple of different ways to handle this. One, you're talking about writing things down. And what are other ways to be able to strengthen your attention, to be able to kind of give you that the armor to face up against the dragon of the future? What is that? What are some ways?
Dragon of the future, I like it.
I have lots of metaphors and references in this thing talking about narrative story design. So that's pardon me for that, but this is how I process things. So
sure.
The dragon of the future, please let me know. I'd love to learn. How do you armor up for that and strengthen your attention?
Sure. Well, it's interesting what you characterize as the dragon here. So maybe I'll twist it a little bit and say, actually, if you think about the dragon is not really the future. The future is kind of just there. Some people think the dragon is uncertainty, because uncertainty is what really creates a psychological burden, and it's really about. But it's not even uncertainty that is really the dragon here. It's our kind of immune response to uncertainty, because what happens is we don't know what's going to happen, and we have more decisions to make, all of which are uncertain. We have more information on which to make those decisions, which sort of adds to the uncertainty, because we don't know what information we don't have. And it can be the tendency is to say, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm going to I'm going to turn away. I'm going to go for black and white answers, like build a wall, or don't do this, or vote to leave. It's just too complex. And so I think it's really about trying to overcome that sort of natural immune response to uncertainty, and say, well, look, uncertainty is there, whether you like it or not. So you can try and run away from it, but it's always going to be there. So you can look at the bits of the future that are easier to forecast. So for example, the Brexit bits or whatever it is. Try to find out what's going on there, and then realize that the rest of it is all possibility for you. If there wasn't any uncertainty, then there's no change. If nothing changes, then there's no kind of future, right? And you don't have to worry about anything. It's the change and the uncertainty that comes with it that provides you the opportunity and the influence to decide what you want to make of the future. And so it's about embracing the uncertainty and then saying, okay, what do I want to make of the future? What can I imagine? Let's apply that strength of thought and imagine what kind of future do I want, and how is it different to today? So in fact, these people at the bank, for example, I asked them, I said, okay, come up with various scenarios. What happens if, the trajectory you've been on, your career trajectory, what is it? What's taken you to where you are now? And if that continues, where you're going to end up? And what happens if, it tails off, if that trend kind of fades away, where do you end up? And then I asked them, I said, what's your moonshot? If you could be anything, what would it be? And for those first two scenarios, they'll talk about things to do with the bank. But for that moonshot, that you could be anything you want to be, almost never anything to do with the bank. People want to be, they want to run a surf shop in Australia, or they want to run an art fund in Barcelona or something else, right? And often the thing they really want to do, and some of them think they want to be the head of the bank in this particular area or something, but actually they don't. When you ask them about it, it's just real drag for them. They don't say anything positive about it. I'm like, well, why do you want to do that? Well, maybe I don't. Maybe I want to do this other thing. And so it's really about imagining it, doing those other things, and also thinking about the obstacles and making it happen.
Got it. So it's really changing your relationship with uncertainty. It's you have one relationship, which is your natural immune response, overcoming your natural immune response to uncertainty, but then being able to change that relationship by actually saying, you know what, uncertainty is actually a good thing, because I can affect it. I can have control over it. I can take action towards it. I can shift, maybe not 100%, but I can shift the probability so that the possibilities can be tilted in my favor by actually addressing the thing I fear most, and actually saying that uncertainty is actually a gift and not a curse, because I can through my own actions affect that change. And if things didn't change, if there was no uncertainty, I'd basically be dead, because there'd be nothing ever would have changed. It'd be static. So it's really interesting.
That's right. Yep.
And so you're looking at, and it's funny. I mean, talking with bankers or anybody else in spaces, it's like they're doing this thing that they, they're in the bank, they're making a living, but maybe they want to run a surf shop. So then, is there a way that you because you're, sounds like you're working with the bank, you're consulting the bank, you're there's a relationship there with the bank. Is there a way that you try to tie together the progress with them working at the bank with their ultimate goal of working at a gift shop? Is there a way that you try to make those connection points, or do you just naturally let it unfold and go, well, maybe you should quit the bank and then just go get a surf shop?
Now, we explore these things. I'm definitely not there to persuade them not to work at a bank. I'm actually there to sort of help them figure out what they want to achieve. Yeah. And often the bank is instrumental in where they want to get to. It's often given them the skills and the ambition to be able to do these other things, and often the finances to be able to do those other things. And so it's it's never that they get off the phone with me and then they they stop they quit the job or anything. But it's really thinking about, okay, what is a career path? What are the possibilities? It's easy to get lazy, right? And in thinking, and just get in a rut, right? And you just sort of follow a career ladder, right? Where do you go next? Well, there's a rung above the one you're on. So I mean, there's not. It seems to be obvious the next place to go, whereas actually, there's often more possibilities than that. So it's just, it's often the case that sometimes they want to do something else in the bank as well, and they kind of realize they should be pushing in some other direction than they are at the moment.
Got it. Yeah. It would be difficult to explain to people that hired you, like, hey, 60% of the people left to go pursue their dreams, but the other 40 are really engaged. So
That's right.
kind of working out for you. But that makes a lot of sense. You talked about people getting stuck in a rut. What are questions or rituals or things to be able to, one, identify that they're in a rut, and then two, be able to take action on it? I mean, is there some ways that people can say, like, become aware that they are, I'm actually doing this thing that I'm not aware of, and then two, how do they take action on that? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, this is in some ways this goes back to the strength of concentration or attention, because all of that leads to awareness. If you're really paying attention to what's going on in yourself and what's around you, you'll become more familiar with the fact that actually I'm doing the wrong thing, or I'm not doing the right thing. And so really, if you could almost think about a spectrum of decisions, if you like, and 99.999% of those things are unconscious, and then there's a small sliver at the end which is conscious. Yeah. And what you want to do is to keep thinking about, okay, what are these conscious decisions I'm making, but what's next to those conscious decisions is actually unconscious that could be conscious if I wanted them to be. And it's a little bit, I mean, you wouldn't normally get up in the morning, if you've got a job, you wouldn't normally get up in the morning every morning think, should I quit today? But it is a decision. Yeah, I mean, it is a decision you're actually implicitly making. Is to say, okay, I'm not going to quit today. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to continue it. But it's probably, you should be asking yourself, it's a big thing, your job and what you're doing there. So you should be testing it. You should be thinking, looking at it quite critically, for example, and saying, is this something I should be doing or not? Yeah. And so there's a lot of decisions like that are kind of implicit. We're thinking we're not making the decision, or we're just continuing what we're doing, but that is a decision in itself. And so you can also decide to start paying attention to those things.
Yeah. Paying attention is expensive. It's one of those things. It's a challenge to do. And I love the idea. I'm visualizing a slider. It's like 99% is unconscious. And you got this one little sliver, and your goal is to just kind of widen that out. The goal being 100% conscious, but never going to get there unless you're some Buddhist monk meditating on a mountain for 40 years or whatever. But it seems like that seems to be the goal. So you're talking about getting more conscious, expanding that consciousness, and being aware of your actions, and being able to shift that over. And also,
indeed, as you say, it's impractical to. It's more even like just dipping into that lake of unconsciousness every now and again, just to check it. It's very difficult to move that needle. Yeah, you tire yourself out. It is.
It'd be very overwhelming if you get it. Sometimes people, for various reasons, whether it's tons of meditation or psychedelics or any other types of means, sometimes they become aware of everything all at once, and it's an overwhelming. It is a survival mechanism that we have to be able to focus only on this little area.
Absolutely.
So it's needed, but it's also sometimes hinders us. Do you have a way to identify if there are if what we're perceiving and what we're paying attention to is hindering us or serving us in terms of this awareness? Like, is there a way to identify that these things are the things I'm aware of are serving or are not serving me? Like, to be able to distinguish between, is this something that is a survival pattern, or this is something that is actually helping me grow into who I want to become?
Well, I think, and I'm not good at it myself, but what you're doing in terms of journaling, I think is probably one of the best ways, because it does force you to consider that thing, and it offers you the chance to observe, to see clearly what isn't working, and or what is working. I tried it for a long time. Is sort of dividing your life up into sort of finances and relationships and career and all that kind of other stuff, and which was useful. And so I'd say that that's probably one of the best tools I've come across, and I'd love it if I had the discipline myself to to do it properly. But that kind of thing where you get to see very clearly black and white, and that's a little bit about framing your environment to make it easier for yourself to be aware and to change if you want to create a new habit. So yeah,
it's actually I tend to journal like a 16-year-old girl. Sad and emotional with candles lit and just write out my feelings, crying. Oh my God, what's going on? It's a cathartic process. But it's what do you think? What are some things in terms of like that are like common thoughts or processes with psychology or organizational psychology that you think are completely wrong or false? What are the common thought process that people might perceive about psychology or organizational psychology that just isn't true, or is maybe a mainstream thought that you don't believe to be true?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. Problem is, I've probably been dealing with those things for too long now.
Are you drinking the Kool-Aid?
Yeah.
Anything comes top to mind of right now that there might be something, or maybe something you started to question, or something that you once believed that then you shifted your belief because of some sort of insider experience?
Well, so there's some things, and actually it's interesting, and this is part of my own sort of learning journey. But I just read a book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, where she talks about this issue about our brains are not for thinking, they are for budgeting. And so we're all constantly predicting into the future to see, okay, how are these things going to play out? And actually, there's elements of, it gets a bit sort of deep, but anyway, our reality or our consciousness that is actually predictive. And so as long as things pan out roughly as our brain is imagining it's going to be panning out, things are fine. And in fact, it could even trick us that we see things that aren't quite true, or experience things that aren't quite true because it's good enough. And our brain goes, okay, it's fine. And it's only when stuff comes out different to our expectations that we take notice. So I think this idea that our brains are for thinking, that we have this sort of 3-part brain of this idea that different parts of the brain are exclusively doing these different jobs. And we have these sort of 3 parts of the brain is one, the lizard brain and the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. All that kind of stuff, I think, is probably misunderstood, and she does well in dealing with that. I'd also say things such as memory. I'd say people kind of regard memory as a record of the past, and I think probably some of that comes from looking at maybe hard drives and stuff in computers. But memory was never supposed to be a record of the past. It's more like an interpretation of our experience. And that interpretation can change, which is why our memories and stuff changes, because it's more like a lake of information that we draw on to make decisions about the future. And when we have an experience, then we kind of throw that into the lake, and then that can reinterpret the experiences that we've already had. And then we take that and then apply it to the future. And all of that happens in roughly the same space in our brain. So when we imagine things, we can imagine the past or we can imagine the future. And in our brains, it's pretty much the same place. So yeah. And so it's quite important to realize that when you're talking about how we think about the future, because it's talking about that kind of workspace in our brains, that whiteboard where the stuff happens, and our working memory. Part of the discipline is how we focus our attention on that, what we choose to put onto that whiteboard, and how we mix those things up is quite critical.
Because you mentioned the book a couple times. What was the name of that book? You're talking about Lisa Barrett and
Lisa Feldman Barrett. She wrote a book called 7.5 7.5 lessons about the brain or something like that. Is that quite recently? Is that this year? Yeah. And then the other book I mentioned was called Prospective Psychology, but that's really an academic book. I'm not going to suggest that anybody try to choke that down.
I like books that have pop-ups, colored pictures, bright and shiny objects. That's
You can color them in yourself a little bit, right?
Yeah. I also like it when like a seasoned old man reads it to me while I'm in the bed. That's
right.
was really my favorite way to take in information. So that's beautiful. Okay, great. So Graham, this has been a pleasure. Is there anything else you'd like to let people know about before you tell them how to get a hold of you and find out more about what you do?
Well, no, I mean, I'd be very happy for people to connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll find me there. My name is Graham Norris, and I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn and see what you're doing. That's one of a real great source of information for me, actually, is my LinkedIn feed. And then when you're there, you can see more about Supertrans Institute, where we're ramping up at the moment. So yeah, I'm hoping that's going to be attractive to people as well. So
beautiful. Thank you, Graham. I really appreciate your time, and I'll be seeing you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dylan. It's been great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Heroes of Reality podcast. Check out heroesofreality.com for more episodes. While you're there, you can also take the Heroes quiz to find out what kind of hero you are. Or, if you have a great story and want to be on the podcast, tell us why your hero's journey will inspire others. Thank you for listening.